The woods were dense, quiet, and cold when I arrived. It was late afternoon, but the sun already felt tired, slipping low behind the trees and casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. I had been planning this solo camping trip for weeks, eager to disconnect from everything. The noise, the city, the constant hum of people. I wanted nothing but the wild and myself. I pulled my backpack from the back of my car and slung it over my shoulder. The air smelled sharp with pine and damp earth. I knew I was somewhere remote. The dirt road that led here was rough and narrow, with no signs of other vehicles. The map had shown a small clearing about a mile in where I could set up my tent. My boots crunched over dry leaves and twigs as I walked, the only sound besides the occasional call of a distant bird. The trees were tall and close, their trunks rough and gray. Some had low branches that snagged my pack, others stood straight as pillars reaching for the sky. I tried to keep my pace steady, not rushing but not stopping either, knowing that once the sun dropped completely, the woods would get darker fast. My phone had barely any signal, but I carried a GPS device just in case. I found the clearing as the light turned golden, the sun now only a thin strip between the treetops. It was about the size of a small backyard, surrounded on all sides by thick woods. The ground was soft with pine needles and moss, and there was a small trickle of water running along one edge, probably a creek fed by recent rains. I could hear it, a gentle murmur beneath the quiet. I set to work unpacking my gear. First, the tent. I had chosen a lightweight, easy-to-assemble model, perfect for solo trips. The poles clicked into place smoothly, and the fabric stretched tight over the frame. I hammered the stakes into the ground firmly, knowing that weather could change quickly. The air was cool now, and the sun was almost gone. Shadows turned to black shapes, and the clearing dimmed to a dull gray. I pulled out my sleeping bag, unrolling it inside the tent. It was thick and warm, made for cold nights. Outside, the temperature was dropping, and I zipped myself in, glad for the insulation. I ate a simple dinner, some canned beans warmed on my small camping stove, and a few crackers. It was quiet, almost too quiet. No sounds of other people, no cars, no planes. Just the occasional rustle in the bushes and the water trickling. After eating, I cleaned up and packed away the stove and utensils. I didn't want to leave any trash or smells that might attract animals. I hung a small lantern from the tent frame, its soft yellow light filling the small space. I lay back, watching the dark fabric above me, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched that had crept in as the darkness settled. The first night passed without incident, though I woke once or twice to strange noises outside. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, distant thuds. I convinced myself it was just deer or raccoons, or the wind pushing dead limbs against the trees. But still, I kept my knife close and my flashlight within reach. Morning came slow, with light bleeding through the tent walls. I stepped out into a chill that made my breath mist in the air. The sun was weak and gray behind clouds, and the forest seemed colder, less inviting. I took a quick walk around the clearing, looking for signs of animals or other people. Nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no trash. Just the forest, unchanged and empty. I filled my water bottle at the creek, careful to avoid disturbing the soft mud. Then I set out on a short hike along a faint trail I had spotted the day before. The trail was narrow, overgrown, and littered with fallen leaves and sticks. I liked it, it felt untouched, wild. I kept my GPS on and made sure to mark my path. As I walked, the forest grew thicker. The trees crowded closer, their branches weaving into a canopy that blocked the sky. The light dimmed, and the air grew damp and heavy. I noticed how the trail became less clear, sometimes disappearing altogether. I stopped to look around, trying to find markers to keep my bearings. Then I saw it. A small pile of stones stacked unevenly near a tree. Someone had been here before me. I didn't like that. It meant I wasn't alone. I scanned the woods, looking for signs of whoever had been here. No footprints, no trash, no movement. I turned back toward the clearing, eager to get back before dark. The hike back felt longer, slower. My legs were tired, my pack heavier than before. When I reached the clearing, The sun was dipping low again. I set up my campfire, arranging dry twigs and pine cones carefully, then struck a match. The fire caught quickly, crackling to life and sending a warm glow into the chill air. I sat close to the fire, warming my hands and watching the flames dance. The forest around me was alive with sounds. Rustling leaves, distant bird calls, the snap of a twig. But beneath it all was something else. A quiet, steady rhythm that felt like footsteps, far but getting closer. I told myself to stay calm. It was probably a deer or a fox moving nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it slowly across the treeline. The beam caught on nothing but waving branches and shadows. I tried to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on the feeling of safety it gave me. But then I heard it. A low, steady crunch, like someone walking carefully but deliberately on the dry leaves. Not one step, but many. The sounds circled the clearing slowly, always just beyond the edge of the firelight. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and scanned again. My heart beat faster, cold sweat gathering on my forehead. I grabbed my knife and held it tight, standing slowly so I could see better. The footsteps stopped. The woods fell silent again. I waited, breath shallow, eyes wide. After what felt like forever, I decided to retreat into the tent. I packed away the fire quickly and crawled inside, zipping the door closed with shaking hands. I held my knife close, the small lantern casting faint shadows on the walls. I lay awake the whole night, listening for any sound. The footsteps never came back, but I could feel eyes on me from the darkness outside. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I didn't want to stay another night in that silence that felt heavy and full of something watching. As I gathered my gear, I noticed something on the edge of the clearing. A series of small, deliberate marks carved into the bark of a tree. They looked like tally marks, deep and fresh. I touched them lightly, feeling the rough wood beneath my fingers. I didn't understand what they meant, but I felt sure I wasn't the first person this had happened to. I hurried back down the trail to my car, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of whoever or whatever had been following me. The forest seemed to watch as I moved, the branches whispering above like dry fingers brushing together. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat inside for a long time, catching my breath and trying to calm down. The radio was dead. The phone had no signal and I was alone. But at least I was out of the woods. Driving back down the dirt road, I glanced into the rearview mirror and thought I saw something move between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing where I'd camped. A shadow, maybe, or a person. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster and faster, until the trees thinned and the sun finally broke through the clouds. That trip taught me that the wilderness can feel like home, until it doesn't. That silence and solitude are not always peaceful. Sometimes they hide something waiting just beyond the light. And sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I still don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know now that when you camp alone, you can't just trust the light or the warmth of a fire. You have to trust your gut, and you have to be ready to leave no matter what. Because in the wild, survival isn't about bravery. It's about knowing when to get out before it's too late. I remember that trip like it was yesterday, even though it was years ago. It wasn't one of those camping trips where everything goes smoothly or you sit around a fire telling jokes. It was the kind of trip that sticks with you because it teaches you how quickly things can turn real and raw in the wilderness. No ghosts, no monsters, just the kind of fear that comes from the real world and the mistakes you make when you think you're prepared but really aren't. I decided to go camping alone, something I'd never done before. I wasn't new to camping. I'd gone with friends plenty of times, but this time I wanted to test myself, see how I'd do on my own, away from anyone else. I packed my backpack the night before carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, enough food for a few days, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a small folding knife. I double-checked everything, or at least I thought I did. I wasn't carrying a phone or any GPS device on purpose, just wanted to unplug completely. I chose a remote spot in a national forest about 100 miles from the nearest town. The trailhead was easy enough to find, and the hike in was nothing too hard. About 5 miles through dense woods, rising and falling along a creek. The weather forecast was clear, no rain, clear skies, and it was late spring, so the temperature should be mild. The first day went as planned. I took my time hiking in, enjoying the fresh air and the quiet. No one else was on the trail. Birds were chirping, leaves rustled in the gentle wind, and the creek babbled beside me. I stopped a few times to take pictures, fill my water bottle, and rest. After a while, I found a small clearing near the creek, where I decided to set up my tent. The ground was soft, flat, and free of rocks, perfect for camping. Setting up the tent was straightforward. I worked carefully, making sure it was secure and stable. After the tent was up, I gathered some dry wood for a fire and set it up in a small fire ring I found already made by previous campers. I built the fire and cooked some dehydrated food I'd brought. Simple but filling. After eating, I sat back and watched the fire flicker under the growing night sky. The stars were out in full force, brighter than I'd ever seen in the city. That night, I slept well, despite the usual sounds of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the brush. It was peaceful. The next day, I planned to hike further along the creek and explore some old logging roads marked on the map I'd brought. I woke early, ate some oatmeal, packed up my small camp, and started hiking again. The air was cooler than the day before, and I noticed how thick the forest was. Tall pine and fir trees with undergrowth that sometimes blocked the path. After a couple of hours, I came across an old abandoned cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in decades. The wood was weathered and gray, some windows broken, the door hanging loosely on its hinges. I was curious and went inside to check it out. It smelled of damp wood and old pine needles, with dust and debris covering the floor. I found an old rusted stove, a broken chair, and some empty cans scattered around. Nothing remarkable, but it gave me a glimpse into the past. Someone had lived here at some point, maybe a logger or hunter. I didn't stay long. I wasn't looking for company or signs of people, really, so I moved on. The trail grew less clear after the cabin. The logging roads I wanted to find were overgrown and difficult to spot. I kept walking, trusting my instincts and the compass I carried. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing with a shallow pond. The water was clear, reflecting the trees and sky. I took a long drink, rested, and ate some snacks. By then, I realized I'd gone further than I planned. The sun was lower, and I had to decide whether to push on or head back to camp. I decided to go back. I didn't want to be out after dark, especially alone. That's when things started to change. The path back looked different somehow. The forest seemed thicker. The light filtering through the canopy was dimmer, even though it was only early evening. I thought maybe the cloud cover was increasing. I kept walking, but after a while, I noticed the trail wasn't as obvious. Some sections were covered in fallen branches, and the trail markers I'd seen earlier were missing or hard to find. I stopped a few times, looking at my compass and map, trying to figure out if I was still on the right path. The creek was supposed to be nearby, but I couldn't hear it anymore. That made me uneasy. Then, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the forest went dark very fast. I switched on my flashlight. The beam was weak but enough to show the trail ahead. I tried to keep calm. I told myself that the forest was dense, that the light just faded quickly, and that I just needed to keep following the compass direction. But then I heard something else. It wasn't an animal. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the noise was real. A soft, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps in dry leaves, coming from behind me. I turned my head slowly, shining the light back, but saw nothing. I started walking faster, keeping my eyes on the path ahead. The noise kept following me, matching my pace but never getting closer, never farther. I tried to focus on breathing, tried to remind myself that animals could make noise, that maybe it was a deer or a raccoon, but the steady crunch made me uneasy. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. I stopped too, heart pounding, listening. Nothing. I moved forward cautiously. Then it started again, this time from the left side, off the trail, in the bushes. I swung my flashlight beam there, but I saw nothing. I called out quietly, not because I thought someone was there, but just to break the silence. No reply. I debated whether to keep moving or stay still. I didn't want to be lost in the dark, but the idea of someone or something following me unsettled me. I decided to keep moving toward where I thought my camp was. After maybe 20 minutes, I spotted a faint light through the trees. It wasn't the campfire I'd left behind. The campfire had gone out hours ago. This was a small light, maybe a flashlight or a lantern, moving slowly. My heart jumped. Someone else was here. I hadn't seen another person on the trail all day. I didn't want to meet anyone. Not here. Not now. Felt dangerous. I thought about turning back, but the thought of losing my way in the dark was worse. I hurried toward the light, hoping it was someone who could help me find the way. When I got closer, I saw it was a man. He was tall, wearing dark clothes, carrying a backpack and a flashlight. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to start a conversation, but he nodded at me. I nodded back, relief washing over me. Finally, someone else. Then, without warning, he started walking away fast, deeper into the forest, without looking back. I was confused. I thought maybe he was going somewhere, but something about the way he moved felt off, hurried, nervous. I hesitated, then decided to follow him. Maybe he knew the way to the trailhead better than me. We moved quickly through the dark woods. The beam of his flashlight bounced ahead, cutting through the trees. I kept my distance but followed. After a few minutes, he stopped near a large fallen tree, crouched down and pulled something from his backpack. I couldn't see well, but it looked like a hunting rifle. My heart raced. I wasn't sure why he had a gun, but I felt my skin crawl. This wasn't a normal hiking or camping situation anymore. Before I could decide what to do, I heard a loud snap nearby, like a branch breaking underfoot. The man tensed and raised the rifle, shining the flashlight beam toward the noise. I froze, unsure if I should speak, move, or run. Then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps coming closer. The man aimed the rifle into the dark. I took a step back. Out of the shadows came a figure, not a person, but a large black bear. It was huge, standing tall on its hind legs for a moment before lowering itself back down and growling low. The man fired once, the shot echoing through the forest. The bear roared and ran off, crashing through the bushes. I stood there, heart pounding, ears ringing. The man lowered the rifle and looked at me, eyes wide. He motioned for me to follow him quickly. We hurried through the woods, the man leading the way, trying to find the trail. I realized then how unprepared I was. No gun, no real way to defend myself against a wild animal like that. After what felt like an eternity, the man stopped, pointing ahead. There it was, the trail I had lost earlier. He nodded once, then disappeared into the trees. I stayed there a moment, catching my breath, then started back toward my camp. I reached my tent just as the sky began to brighten with the first hints of dawn. I was shaken but safe. That morning, I packed up and hiked out quickly. When I got back to my car, I told the ranger at the station about the bear encounter and the man with the rifle. He told me the forest was known for black bears, especially at this time of year when food was scarce. He also warned that there had been reports of poachers and people illegally hunting in the area. That trip taught me a lot. I've always liked camping by myself. There's something about being out in the woods, away from people and noise, that helps me clear my head. Usually, I pick spots that aren't crowded or well-known, so I can have the forest mostly to myself. This particular trip started like any other, but it turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. I planned to camp for 3 nights deep in a national forest far from the main roads. The area wasn't popular and didn't have marked trails, but I had a rough map I'd made from old satellite images and topographic data. My plan was to hike in about 5 miles from the nearest dirt road, find a flat spot near a small creek I saw on the map, set up camp, and just relax. I wanted peace and quiet, and maybe some fishing in the creek. I packed light but took everything I thought I'd need. A decent tent, sleeping bag rated for cold nights, enough food for 3 days, my fishing gear, a headlamp, a small camping stove, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and a sturdy knife. I also brought a GPS and a compass, but I mostly relied on my map and the natural landmarks. The first day went smoothly. I left early in the morning and spent most of the day walking through thick woods. The forest was mostly pine and oak, with a thick underbrush in some places, but mostly easy enough to move through. I stopped often to check the map, find the creek on the GPS, and mark my progress. The sun was warm, and the forest smelled fresh and alive. By late afternoon, I reached the creek. It was smaller than I expected, more like a steady stream with clear, cold water running over smooth stones. I found a flat patch nearby, about 100 yards from the creek bank, with enough space to pitch my tent. The ground was soft but dry, with pine needles covering most of it. I gathered some dry sticks and pine cones for a fire, set up my tent, and cooked some dinner over the stove. As the sun dipped below the trees, the forest grew quiet except for the sound of the creek and the occasional birds settling in for the night. I sat by the small fire I managed to get going, wrapped in my jacket against the cool evening air. I felt calm and tired, ready for a good night's sleep. Night fell completely, and the forest grew darker than I'd imagined. Without the moon and stars shining through the thick branches, it was almost pitch black except for my firelight. I double-checked my knife, set my headlamp on the tent floor beside me, and crawled into my sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke up. Something was off. It wasn't the usual sounds of a forest at night, like distant animal calls or the wind rustling through the trees. This was different. There was a faint rustling nearby, but not like animals moving through leaves. It was heavier and more deliberate. My heart started to beat faster. I stayed still and quiet, trying to listen. The rustling stopped after a few seconds, but then I heard it again, this time closer. It was coming from the edge of the clearing where I'd set up camp. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. Outside, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I scanned the woods with the light. I didn't see anything at first, just trees and shadows. Then I noticed something odd, footprints in the soft soil near the edge of the clearing. They were large, much bigger than mine, and they didn't look like animal tracks. The shape was roughly human, but they were bigger and deeper than any normal person's feet. My mind raced. I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person. There aren't bears or mountain lions in that part of the forest, but I'd heard stories of hunters or poachers sneaking around. I didn't want to believe someone was nearby, but the footprints told me otherwise. I decided to stay in the tent, turn off the flashlight, and try to be as quiet as possible. I kept my knife close, but I didn't want to make any noise that would draw attention. The rest of the night passed slowly. I could hear more rustling at times, and once, a twig snapped loud enough to make me jump, but I never saw anyone or anything. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted and tense. The morning light helped me relax a little. I packed up quickly, leaving the fire and all my stuff behind, and started walking back toward the road. As I moved through the forest, I kept looking behind me, expecting to see someone following or watching. When I got to the dirt road, I felt a mix of relief and fear. I debated whether to call the local ranger station, but I didn't want to sound crazy or cause a fuss if it was nothing. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints and the noises. I did some research and found out that area had some illegal hunting activity. People who poached animals sometimes camped in the woods and didn't want to be found. It made sense. Those large footprints were probably boots, not feet, and whoever made them was hiding nearby. I went back to that forest weeks later with friends, and we looked around the area where I camped. We found some old makeshift campsites, empty beer cans, and even a rusted rifle case. It confirmed what I suspected. There were people living in the woods, possibly hunting illegally, and they probably noticed me that night. The scariest part wasn't the presence of wildlife, but knowing that people could be lurking just out of sight, watching, and willing to stay silent and hidden. The forest is big and wild, but sometimes the real danger is other humans. Since then, I've been more careful about where I camp and how I approach remote wilderness areas. I learned to trust my instincts and stay aware of signs that I'm not alone. Camping is still one of my favorite ways to get away, But that night taught me that even the quietest woods can hold unexpected threats. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't creatures from stories. They're real people with unknown intentions, hidden just beyond the trees. The sun was dipping low behind the thick line of trees, casting long, stretched shadows over the uneven ground. I had been hiking for hours, my boots heavy and my pack digging into my shoulders. I was about 10 miles deep into a forest that locals called the Black Pine Wilderness, a stretch of land so dense and wild that few people bothered to explore it. My plan was simple: find a good spot to camp for the night, rest, and then hike out the next day. No one knew exactly where I was, but I wasn't worried. I had done solo camping trips before, enough to be cautious but confident. I found a clearing just big enough for my tent, surrounded by tall pine trees. The air was cold, even for early September, with a faint smell of damp earth and pine needles. I unpacked methodically, laying out my sleeping bag, setting up the small camp stove, and gathering firewood. The forest was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. As the sky turned from blue to the deep purples and blacks of dusk, I built a fire. It took longer than usual. Maybe the wood was a bit damp, but eventually, I had a good flame crackling. I sat close, the warmth soaking into my chilled bones, watching the flickering light push the darkness away just enough to keep the shadows at bay. The forest felt alive around me, but not in a peaceful way. There was an uneasy stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. I kept checking my surroundings, eyes darting to the tree line every few minutes. The only noises were the fire popping and the wind stirring the needles overhead. I ate a simple meal of canned beans heated over the stove, washing it down with water from my bottle. When the food was done, I packed everything away carefully, not wanting to attract any animals with leftover scraps. I made sure my backpack was zipped tight and hung it from a tree branch away from the tent, just in case. As the night grew darker, I lay back inside my tent, the thin fabric muffling the sounds outside but not blocking them completely. The forest seemed to close in around me. I could hear twigs snapping somewhere nearby, slow footsteps moving just beyond the firelight's reach. At first, I thought it was a deer or some kind of animal, but the steps were too deliberate, too slow. I tried to steady my breathing, reminding myself that animals in the wild don't usually sneak around like humans. I had my knife with me, strapped to my belt, and a flashlight close by. I reached out, flicking it on, the beam cutting through the tent fabric and onto the clearing outside. Nothing, just the trees silent and still. I rolled over and closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but the noises continued. Scratches and soft thuds came from the perimeter of the clearing. The firelight flickered, casting odd shadows on the trunks. I thought maybe the wind was playing tricks, or the fire was making the noises as branches cracked in the heat. Suddenly, I heard a heavy thud nearby, like something large hitting the ground. My heart jumped, and I grabbed the flashlight, throwing the beam outside. There was nothing, but the fire was low now, the logs nearly burnt through. I needed more wood. I zipped the tent and stepped outside carefully, flashlight in hand. The air was colder than before, sharp enough to sting my cheeks. The forest around me was pitch black except where the fire cast a soft glow. I moved slowly to the woodpile I'd left a few feet from the tent. When I got there, I stopped cold. The pile was disturbed. Some of the logs scattered, broken, as if something had been digging through it. I shone the light around. No animals, no visible movement, just the trees towering and dark. The sense of being watched crept up my spine. I grabbed a handful of dry sticks and logs, piling them back carefully, trying not to make noise. My eyes scanned the tree-line, searching for any sign of movement. I returned to the fire and set the wood down. Before I could start stacking it, I heard it again. A slow crunch of leaves to my left, barely audible but definitely there. My body tensed. I raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the darkness. A pair of eyes caught the light for a second, reflecting green and unblinking. It vanished instantly. I strained to see where it had gone, but only saw empty space, thick trunks, and tangled bushes. My mind raced. Bears? No, their eyes usually reflect orange. A wildcat? Maybe, but something about the size didn't fit. Too tall, too still. The hair on my neck prickled. I threw more wood on the fire and stepped back to the tent. I closed the zipper behind me, fumbling to secure the flap. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. I grabbed my knife and flashlight, keeping them close. The rest of the night stretched out long and empty, save for the occasional noise of branches snapping or leaves rustling just beyond the firelight. I didn't dare leave the tent until the first pale light of dawn. When morning came, I poked my head out cautiously. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to cold ashes. The scattered wood was still there, as I left it last night, except now some footprints circled the pile. I knelt down, shining my flashlight over the prints. They were large, wider than any bear or deer, with a shape more like a human's but blurred and uneven, as if the person or thing had been dragging a foot. I felt a cold pit in my stomach. Someone had been there during the night, maybe watching me. I packed quickly, breaking camp with careful hands. I avoided looking into the forest's darker patches as I gathered my gear. I told myself it was just some hunter or camper who had wandered close. Nothing more, but the uneasy feeling stayed. As I hiked back along the trail, I kept looking over my shoulder. The forest seemed quieter than before, almost too quiet. No birds, no rustling animals, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt path. I moved faster, keeping a steady pace until the trees began to thin and the distant hum of a road grew louder. When I finally reached the ranger station at the edge of the wilderness, I told them about the footprints and the noises. They nodded seriously and warned me to be careful, saying there had been recent reports of people living illegally in the woods. Some dangerous, desperate types hiding from the law. The thought chilled me. The forest wasn't haunted. It wasn't magic or ghost stories. It was real people out there, hiding in the shadows, and I had unknowingly come too close. After that, I never went back to Black Pine Wilderness. The memory stayed with me. The cold night, the heavy footsteps, the eyes in the dark. It was a reminder that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you can't explain. It's what you know is real, and what you realize you might have walked right into without even noticing. It was the kind of summer evening I'll never forget, even though I wish I could. The kind of night that starts like any other camping trip but turns into something that keeps your heart racing long after you're back in the safety of your own home. The trip itself was supposed to be simple. A weekend alone in the woods, just me, my gear, and a patch of wilderness somewhere far from the noise of the city. No phones, no distractions, no people. Just a chance to clear my head and enjoy the quiet. I had picked the spot myself. It was a small clearing about a mile off the main trail, deep enough that I wouldn't run into many hikers, but not so far I couldn't get out if something went wrong. The kind of place people camp when they want to feel like they're really out in nature, but without taking too many risks. I'd been out camping plenty of times before, so I felt confident. I packed the usual stuff: a tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a lantern, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I always like to keep things simple. I set off early in the afternoon. The weather was clear, the sun shining warm through the trees as I made my way along the trail. Birds were chirping. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. I remember feeling peaceful, like the whole world had slowed down just for me. The trail was well marked, but as I moved further in, the sounds of civilization faded quickly. No cars, no distant voices, just the crunch of my boots on the dirt and leaves. I kept my pace steady, knowing I had maybe 2 hours of daylight left to reach the clearing, set up camp, and get ready for night. When I reached the clearing, it was exactly what I'd hoped for. A flat patch surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream running nearby. The grass was soft and dry, perfect for my tent. I dropped my pack and began setting up. The tent went up quickly, one of those dome styles with poles that snap into place. As I hammered the stakes in and stretched the rainfly, I noticed how quiet it was. No bugs buzzing, no wind in the leaves, just an eerie stillness. At first, I thought it was peaceful, but the silence felt heavier than usual. After I finished, I gathered some firewood from around the edge of the clearing. Dead branches, dry sticks, enough to get a fire going but nothing that would cause a huge blaze. I was careful about fire safety, never want to start a forest fire, even by accident. By the time the sun was just a sliver below the horizon, I had a decent fire crackling and my lantern hanging from a tree branch nearby. I sat by the fire with a small can of beans I'd heated on a portable stove, eating slowly as the sky darkened. Stars began to appear one by one, clear and bright in the open sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, and I felt that familiar smallness, the kind you get when you're staring up at the universe and realize how tiny you really are. Then came the sounds. First, faint, almost like footsteps, but too soft and irregular to be human. I stopped eating and listened carefully. There was definitely something out there, just beyond the ring of firelight. Maybe a deer or some other animal. The woods were alive after all. I told myself not to worry, but my heart was already starting to speed up. I packed my food away and put everything in my pack to avoid attracting animals. I settled back against a log, staring into the fire, trying to shake the unease. The sounds returned, closer this time. Cracking twigs, rustling leaves. Something was moving just outside the clearing, but I couldn't see anything. The firelight barely touched the edge of the woods. I thought about grabbing my flashlight, but something held me back. Maybe fear, maybe stubbornness. The night grew colder. I zipped up my sleeping bag and wrapped my arms around my knees. The fire was dying down now, just glowing embers. I could hear the stream nearby, water flowing gently over rocks. I tried to focus on that sound, comforting and steady. Suddenly, a loud snap shattered the silence. Not a twig breaking, but a heavy crack, like a large branch falling. My head whipped toward the noise. In the shadows just beyond the firelight, something moved quickly. My breath caught. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise, but the beam caught nothing. No animal, no person, just trees and darkness. I told myself it was nothing, probably just a tree limb giving way. But then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate step, something heavy moving carefully through the underbrush. Not fast like a scared animal running, but slow and steady, like someone trying not to be seen. I grabbed my small pocket knife from my belt and stayed as quiet as possible. The steps stopped near the edge of the clearing. I could hear breathing, shallow and controlled. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another camper? Someone lost? Or worse, someone who didn't belong out here? For the next hour, I stayed awake, eyes darting between the dark woods and my dying fire. The footsteps never came closer, but the feeling of being watched grew heavier with every passing minute. I tried to think logically. The nearest trail was miles away. No one else was supposed to be here. When the fire finally went out, I fumbled to light my lantern again. The weak yellow light barely cut through the thick darkness. Then I heard something else, voices. Low murmurs just out of hearing, like people talking in hushed tones. But there were no other campers around. The trailhead was deserted when I arrived. I stayed quiet, trying to pinpoint the direction. The voices seemed to circle the clearing, coming from different sides, but always staying just beyond the light's reach. I wanted to call out, but the thought of breaking the silence terrified me. If whoever it was meant harm, yelling might provoke them. I remembered the map in my pack and grabbed it, along with my compass. If I could get out quickly, I'd try to reach the trailhead before dawn. I stuffed my gear back into the pack quietly, careful not to make noise. Every crack of a stick underfoot seemed loud in the still night. When I finally stood up, the voices stopped instantly. It was as if they vanished into thin air. I strained my ears, but only the wind rustling leaves and the stream's flow remained. I took a deep breath and started walking toward the edge of the clearing, heading for the main trail. The forest seemed endless in the dark, every tree a potential hiding place. I kept the lantern low, not wanting to draw attention. My feet crunched softly on dry leaves and twigs. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the narrow trail. The voices didn't return, but I kept moving fast, not looking back. The path twisted and climbed, the forest growing denser as I walked. My lungs burned from the cold air and effort, but I forced myself onward. After another 30 minutes, I caught sight of faint lights in the distance, the parking lot near the trailhead. Relief surged through me like a wave. I broke into a run. The lights grew brighter, and soon I was out of the woods and standing in the open, where a few cars were parked. There was a ranger station nearby, and a couple of hikers sat by their vehicles, chatting quietly. I walked up, my hands shaking, and told them I needed help. The ranger listened carefully when I explained I'd been camping alone and heard people moving around my site, but saw no one. He nodded, serious. He said it wasn't the first time someone reported strange sounds or signs of people lurking near campsites, but there were no official reports of crimes or intruders in that area. Still, he agreed to escort me back to my campsite at first light. The next morning, the ranger and I hiked back together. The clearing looked peaceful in the daylight, sun filtering through the trees, birds singing. But when we examined the area near my tent, we found signs that someone had been there recently. Footprints, too large to be any animal, circling the perimeter, some broken branches at head height, like someone had crouched or tried to hide. There were no other signs of violence or damage, but the feeling of unease I'd had the night before suddenly made sense. Someone had been watching me, maybe even following me, but why? The ranger said he would increase patrols, but warned me to be cautious next time. That trip taught me more about the wilderness than any camping guide ever could. It's not just the elements or the animals that can threaten you out there. Sometimes it's the other people, strangers with unclear intentions, hidden in the dark, watching, waiting. I don't camp alone anymore, and when I do, I stick to busy campgrounds where I can see other people around. Because the woods can feel safe and quiet one moment, and in the next, completely different. And the difference isn't always something you can see. Sometimes it's just a feeling cold, heavy, and real. The first time I decided to go camping alone, I thought it would be a simple, peaceful break from the noise of everyday life. I'd gone camping before, but always with friends or family. This time, I wanted to test myself, to see how I'd handle being completely alone in the wilderness, away from any other people. I chose a spot I'd found on an old map, a place deep in the woods of a national forest I'd never explored. It was far enough away from roads and trails to guarantee I'd have solitude. The day I left, the sky was clear, the sun warm but not hot, and the air smelled like pine and fresh earth. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, water purification tablets, a small first aid kit, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a pocket knife, and a basic map and compass. I didn't bring a phone signal booster or anything fancy because I wanted it to feel real, not like a controlled adventure. The drive out was long and winding. The closer I got to the forest, the fewer cars I saw on the road. Eventually, I turned off onto a gravel path that disappeared between towering trees. The gravel gave way to dirt and then a narrow trail that was barely wide enough for my car. After about an hour, I parked near a small clearing, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. The trail was rough and uneven, overgrown in parts, and no one else was around. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on dry leaves, the occasional bird call, and the wind rustling branches. I walked for nearly 2 hours before I found what I was looking for. A small flat clearing surrounded by thick trees, with a shallow creek running along one edge. The spot was perfect, quiet, private, with fresh water nearby. I set up my tent slowly, making sure the ground was level and free of rocks or sticks. Then I unpacked my gear, built a small fire pit out of stones, and gathered firewood. The forest was dense, with tall pines and thick underbrush. Moss covered the ground in patches, and the smell of damp wood filled the air. As the sun started to dip below the horizon, I built a small fire. The crackle of the flames was comforting. I sat close, wrapped in a blanket, eating a simple meal of canned beans and crackers. The forest grew darker, and the temperature dropped sharply. The night was cool but not cold. I listened to the sounds of insects and the occasional rustle of small animals nearby. The first night passed without incident. I slept fitfully, waking now and then to the sounds of the forest. Every crack and snap made me alert, but I reminded myself it was just nature doing its thing. No one else was around. The next day, I decided to explore more. I followed the creek upstream, careful not to stray too far from my camp. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. I found signs of wildlife, tracks from deer and rabbits, a few scattered feathers, and fresh scat from some animal I couldn't identify. As I walked, I kept my eyes open for anything unusual. The forest seemed alive in a way I hadn't fully appreciated before. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, and the smell of pine and wet earth was strong. By midday, the sky had clouded over, and a light rain began to fall. I headed back to camp, the trail slick and muddy underfoot. When I got back, I rebuilt the fire and huddled near it under a tarp I'd strung between two trees. The rain was steady but not heavy, and the forest seemed darker under the gray sky. That night, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and swayed, and branches scraped against the tent. I double-checked my tent stakes and ropes, making sure everything was secure. I kept the fire burning, though the wet wood made it harder to keep going. The wind whistled through the trees, and I could hear something moving outside the clearing. Branches breaking, leaves rustling. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Around midnight, the noises got closer. I was awake, listening intently. Something was moving just outside the tree line. The sounds weren't right for an animal, too heavy, too deliberate. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the beam only caught shifting shadows. The wind died down suddenly, and with it, the forest seemed to hold its breath. I felt a cold wave of fear I hadn't expected. I stayed as still as I could, clutching my knife. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds moved away slowly, fading back into the distance. I waited for a long time before trying to sleep again. The next morning, I found evidence that whatever had been near my camp had left marks. A few small branches had been snapped, and there were deep, heavy footprints pressed into the damp soil near the edge of the clearing. They were unlike any animal tracks I knew. The prints were large, wider than a human foot, and the shape was odd, broad and flat with deep grooves. I tried not to panic, telling myself maybe they were from some unknown animal. I took pictures with my phone, even though I had no signal, hoping to identify them later. But something didn't sit right. That day, I stayed close to camp, building my fire larger and packing some more wood under the tarp. I moved my supplies into the tent to protect them from the rain, which had returned steadily. The forest felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the light seemed dimmer through the thick gray clouds. By evening, I realized I hadn't heard the usual forest sounds. No birds singing, no insects buzzing. The silence was unnatural. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, feeling watched. The feeling grew stronger as night fell. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed nearby, breaking the silence. I jumped up, flashlight ready, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. My heart pounded. The firelight flickered, casting strange shadows. I tried to focus on practical things, checking my gear, reinforcing the tent, making sure I had a clear path to the creek for water. But my mind kept returning to the strange footprints and the heavy sounds outside. Sleep was impossible. I stayed awake until dawn, listening to every noise. At first light, I packed most of my things, ready to leave. But as I prepared to hike back, I realized the trail was gone. The rain had washed it away, or maybe I had lost it somehow. I wandered through the trees, trying to find familiar markers, but nothing looked right. The forest seemed endless, thick, and tangled. The creek was nowhere to be seen. Panic rose in my chest. I tried to calm myself, pulling out the compass and map. But the compass needle spun oddly, not settling on any direction. I double-checked the map, trying to orient myself by the position of the sun and landmarks. Nothing matched. Hours passed, and the sky darkened again with thick clouds. I was lost. I built a small fire to keep warm and signal if anyone passed by. but the forest remained silent. No planes, no voices, no other campers. I rationed my food and water carefully, knowing I might be here for a while. Days blurred together. I marked trees with scratches to keep track of where I'd been. I followed animals' tracks hoping they'd lead me out, but the forest swallowed me in. At night, the heavy footsteps returned, always at the edge of my camp. I could hear breathing, heavy and slow, but never see anyone. The fear grew into a dull ache inside my chest. On the fourth day, my supplies were almost gone. I was weak, cold, and my mind was foggy. I considered staying put and waiting for rescue, but I had no idea if anyone even knew where I was. That night, the footsteps came closer than ever before. I heard them circle the camp, sometimes stopping just outside my tent. I didn't dare move. As dawn broke, I heard something else, a faint sound. A motor? I scrambled out of the tent and started walking toward the noise, hoping for help. After an exhausting walk, I found a dirt road and soon after a ranger station. The ranger was surprised to see me alive, explaining that the area I'd camped in was part of an old, unmarked forest section, prone to heavy storms and with no clear trails. He said other hikers had reported strange noises and large footprints, but no clear explanation. I told him about the heavy footsteps near my camp, the strange footprints, the compass spinning. He nodded thoughtfully and said that sometimes, in dense forests, magnetic interference can make compasses act strangely. As for the footsteps and noises, he suggested it might have been a large, unknown animal, possibly a bear or wild boar, although no official sightings were confirmed in that area recently. He warned me to avoid that section in the future and to always check in with rangers before heading into deep woods. Looking back, I'm convinced I wasn't alone in that forest. Whatever was following me wasn't a ghost or something supernatural. It was something real, something alive, something that knew how to move quietly, how to watch without revealing itself. The fear I felt was not from stories or legends, but from the raw, real sense of being hunted in a place that had no rules and no mercy. I never went camping alone again, and whenever I see a dense forest or hear a strange noise in the woods, I had been meaning to take some time off work for a while, just to get away from everything and breathe in some clean air without cell service or emails. Things had been piling up back at the office. My head was full of unfinished tasks, people talking over each other in meetings, constant background noise. The city had started to feel like a cage I was stuck in. I wanted out just for a few days. I wanted trees, quiet, and enough space around me that I didn't hear anyone else breathe. I picked a spot up in the northern part of the state, about a 5-hour drive from where I lived. It wasn't a formal campground with electricity or water hookups, just a patch of land near a river I'd read about on a backpacking forum. One of those places that don't show up on official maps but get passed around between people who like to be alone. I knew from reading trip reports that it wasn't heavily trafficked, especially in the middle of the week. I timed it so I'd arrive on a Tuesday and be out by Friday. I packed light but smart. I brought a good tent, a tarp, 2 days of extra food just in case, a sleeping bag rated for colder weather than I expected, a simple stove, and one of those water filters you can drink straight from a stream with. I even brought one of those mini shovels to dig a proper latrine because I didn't want to leave trash or waste around like some people do. I brought a knife, a multi-tool, and a first aid kit. No gun. I don't carry, but I wasn't too worried. I'd done solo trips before. As long as you're careful, most problems don't come out of nowhere. I left early Tuesday morning, hit the road while it was still dark. The first couple hours were freeway, then it turned into winding mountain roads. I didn't mind. The air smelled different once I got past the last small town. Less gas fumes, more pine. The kind of smell you only get in forests where nothing has been cleared in a long time. I kept the windows down and let it fill the car. I got to the turnoff around noon. It wasn't marked, just a gravel path leading off the main road, barely wide enough for my car. I followed it for about 2 miles until it ended in a small clearing with a circle of stones where people had clearly made fires in the past. Beyond that, just trees. Thick, wild trees, growing in every direction like they'd been there for hundreds of years. It was beautiful. No trash, no signs of recent campers. Just the wind moving through the branches. I parked and unpacked everything. Took me about an hour to hike to the river. There was no trail, just the GPS coordinates I'd loaded into my phone and an old topographical map someone had scanned online. I didn't want to rely on the phone too much, but I kept it on airplane mode to save battery. The forest got denser as I went deeper in. More undergrowth, more roots to trip over, more branches that snagged on my pack. When I found the river, I almost walked past it. It wasn't big, just a narrow stream, really, but fast-moving and cold, probably snowmelt from higher up. There was a flat patch of ground nearby that looked good for a tent. I checked for rocks, cleared a few small branches, and got everything set up. By late afternoon, I was lying in my sleeping bag, just listening to the water. It was perfect. The first night passed without anything weird. I cooked some freeze-dried chili, made tea, and sat by the fire until the stars came out. The sky looked like something out of a painting. No city lights to dull it, just blackness and stars everywhere. I heard a few animal calls, but nothing too close. Probably raccoons or maybe a fox. I'd hung my food up in a tree a good distance from the tent, like you're supposed to. I fell asleep warm and calm. The second day, I hiked upstream for a few miles. No path, just following the water. I found a spot where it widened out and formed a pool deep enough to sit in. The water was freezing, but I stripped down and got in anyway. Felt like jumping into a new body. Shocked me awake. I stayed in for maybe 2 minutes, then dried off and laid on a rock to warm up. No one around, no sounds but the water and birds. That evening I made pasta and watched the fire until it burned down to red coals. Still no trouble. Still quiet. It was the third day when things changed. I woke up around 5 in the morning. I don't know what stirred me, but my eyes opened before the sun came up. Everything was still. The kind of still where you know something's off. Usually at that time, birds start making noise. The forest comes alive with rustling and fluttering and all those little sounds you don't notice until they're gone. But that morning, nothing. Just dead silence and the faint sound of water. I sat up and listened harder. The air felt cold, not temperature-wise, but something else. Like the kind of cold you get in your chest before something bad happens. I unzipped the tent and looked out. Nothing seemed out of place. My food was still hanging. The fire pit was still full of old ash. But that stillness wouldn't go away. I didn't eat breakfast. Just packed a small bag with water, my knife, the map, and a few snacks and decided to walk south, just to stretch my legs and see more of the forest. I marked the path back with small stacks of stones and tied bits of orange ribbon I'd brought with me onto low branches. I wasn't going to get lost. About an hour into the hike, I found something that made me stop. It was an old backpack, half rotted, sitting under a tree like it had been dropped there years ago, covered in moss. One of the straps was torn. I stepped closer, careful not to touch it. A corner of it had been chewed through, probably by rodents. There were claw marks in the dirt nearby. Not huge, not bear-sized, more like something a dog might leave, but wide-set and deep. I looked around and didn't see any other signs of people. No boots, no broken twigs, no old campsites. Just that pack, just sitting there like it was waiting to be noticed. I took a picture with my phone, marked the spot on my map, and kept going. I didn't like the feeling I had, but I told myself it was just trash from some hiker years ago. Could have been anything. Could have been nothing. The air kept getting heavier the deeper I walked, though. Not hotter, just harder to breathe. Every step felt like it took more energy than it should have. I kept walking until I realized something weird. I'd been marking my path back with ribbon and stones the whole way, but when I turned to head back, I didn't see any of them. I retraced my steps carefully, looked for the last orange ribbon I'd tied. Nothing. No stones, no markers. It was like they'd been removed. Not blown away or fallen, just gone. Like someone had come behind me and cleaned up every sign I'd left. I stopped walking and stood still for a long time. I listened. Still no birds. Still no wind. Just the sound of water far away. I took out my map and compass, checked my direction. I knew roughly where my camp should be, so I headed that way, but now everything looked the same. Trees in every direction. Nothing stood out. After about 30 minutes of hiking in what I hoped was the right direction, I found a tree with bark stripped off in a long vertical line. Fresh, not old, not worn. Something had clawed it recently. Not a person, this was too high up. Could have been a bear, I guess, but it didn't look like any bear scratch I'd seen. The lines were uneven and shallow, more like something testing the bark rather than tearing through it. That's when I started to hear movement. Soft behind me, not steps, just the sound of branches bending maybe 20 or 30 feet back. I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, but I moved faster, kept my knife in my hand. It wasn't paranoia anymore. Something was back there. I didn't know what, but I could feel its eyes. By the time I stumbled back into my campsite, my shirt was soaked in sweat and my legs were shaking. I didn't see anything following me, but I didn't stop to look. I collapsed near the fire pit and stayed there, breathing hard. I told myself I was fine. Told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer or something. But I didn't believe it. I looked up at the food bag still hanging. It had been cut down. Not clawed, not chewed. Cut, clean, straight edge. Like someone had taken a knife to the rope and walked off with the food. Nothing else was touched. My tent was still zipped. My stove and supplies were still there. Just the food, gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with my back to the tent and stared into the dark. I kept hearing things. Small twigs snapping, footsteps too light to be from something heavy. Once, I thought I saw a figure through the trees, but it was gone before I could focus. Not running, just standing there, watching. When the sun finally rose, I packed everything in 20 minutes and left. I didn't care about the planned fourth day. I didn't care about breakfast. I just wanted out. I didn't bother to follow the map or trail markers. I just used the compass and kept moving west, where I knew the road was. I didn't stop until I hit the gravel path where my car was still parked, untouched. When I finally got in and locked the doors, I sat there for 5 minutes with the engine off, staring into the forest. I never saw what it was, never got a name for it, but it wasn't an animal. It wasn't a person out for a hike. It was something or someone who didn't want me there, who knew how to move quietly, how to track without leaving signs, how to make sure you didn't find your way back. It started with a plan I made on a quiet Sunday evening, sitting alone in my apartment in the city, with the soft hum of traffic coming through the windows. I had been working long weeks without a proper break. My job was stressful, all computers and clients and late-night emails. I was getting headaches more often than not, my back always tight, and I hadn't seen the sky full of stars in what felt like years. I decided I needed to be far away from people, phones, and especially the office. So I picked a place I remembered from a hiking trip years ago, deep in a national forest out west, far enough from cell service and even farther from crowds. I'd only been there once, but it had stuck with me. A small clearing near a cold creek, surrounded by tall pine and fir trees, quiet except for the wind and the sounds of birds. No campground, no marked trails, just a faint, barely used path that led through the trees. I prepped for 3 days. I cleaned my gear, tested the camp stove, sharpened my knife, bought freeze-dried food, packed a tent, 2 tarps, clothes, a solar charger, and 2 backup power banks. I brought a basic first aid kit, bear spray, and a .45 I kept legally with my hiking gear. I had all the basics and then some. I had done this before. Not this exact trip, but enough like it to know how to stay safe. Still, I triple-checked everything. I also left a map and notes with a friend, something I always did before trips like this. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, with the sun barely up over the horizon. Took a few hours to get into the forest. The main road turned into gravel, then dirt, then barely a road at all. I parked my car in a shaded area behind a thick patch of trees where it wouldn't be easily spotted. Took my pack, locked everything, and started hiking. The first few miles were on a regular trail, nothing difficult. Then I veered off where the old path branched, overgrown with grass and brush, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. I had marked it on an old topographic map and saved GPS coordinates just in case. I hiked deep into the forest. The air got cooler, the light dimmer. The trees grew thicker, taller. After a couple hours, I stopped for water and a snack. Then I kept going. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anyone. That was the point. I finally reached the clearing I remembered late in the afternoon, just before sunset. It looked almost the same, thicker brush on one side, but the same creek flowing through, the same ring of trees surrounding it, open sky right above. It felt untouched. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground a few feet from the creek, where the sound of the water could help me sleep. I hung a tarp between two trees as a rain shelter, set up my camp stove on a rock slab, unpacked, and sat on a log as the sky turned orange. I felt good. No sounds except birds and wind. No emails. No people. Just nature, clean air, and time. That night, I stayed up by a small fire I built in the fire ring left by someone years ago. I boiled water for food, ate slowly, listened to the woods. I heard owls, insects, frogs, the kind of sounds that only happen when nothing else is around. Then I got in my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. I had trouble falling asleep at first, not because I was scared, but because I wasn't used to silence like that. Real silence. No cars, no city noise, just the creek and the wind. I finally drifted off. I woke up once in the night to pee and stepped outside with my headlamp. I stood there for a few minutes, looking at the stars. It was clear, cold, beautiful. Then I crawled back into my sleeping bag and slept again. The next day was perfect. I went for a hike past the clearing, following the creek upstream, climbing rocks and stepping over logs. I found an old deer trail and followed it for a while. I saw tracks, deer, maybe elk, and signs of small animals. Squirrels, rabbits. I saw bear scat too, but it was old. I wasn't too concerned. I came back to camp in the late afternoon, sweaty and tired but satisfied. I refilled my water filter, made food, and ate by the fire again. That night, sleep came easier. On the third day, something felt different. It started in the morning. I woke up early, as the light was just starting to creep through the trees. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and walked out into the chilly air. I went to the creek to splash water on my face. That's when I noticed it. A branch snapped somewhere off in the woods. Not close, not far. Just far enough that I couldn't see the source, but I could hear it. One single crack, like someone had stepped on a thick stick. At first, I didn't think much of it. Could have been a deer or even a bear. I made noise to let whatever it was know I was there. I moved around, talked to myself loudly while making breakfast. But something felt off. I kept glancing into the trees, not because I thought I saw something, but because I didn't want to miss anything. It felt like someone was watching, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I went on another hike that day but kept closer to camp. I didn't feel as relaxed. Every sound made me pause. I started noticing things that hadn't stood out before. Scratches on a tree trunk that looked too high for a deer. Small things like a crushed mushroom that looked too cleanly stepped on. Again, maybe it was just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, listening. At one point, I turned off my headlamp and just sat in the tent, not moving. I thought I heard breathing, not close but steady. I held my breath and tried to hear again, but it was gone. It might have been the wind, or it might have been nothing. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and saw something that made my stomach drop. My tarp had been taken down. Not ripped, not torn. Just neatly unstrapped from one tree, one side hanging loose, like someone had done it calmly and carefully. I stood there staring at it for a while. I hadn't heard anything during the night. No footsteps, no voices. I walked around the camp, checked everything. Nothing else was touched. Food was untouched. Nothing was missing. No footprints I could see, just that one loose strap on the tarp. I spent the day gathering wood and stacking it, like I was preparing for something. I didn't go hiking. I stayed near camp, kept my pack close, and double-checked the safety on my gun. I kept thinking through it. An animal wouldn't unstrap a tarp. Wind might rip it off, but not like that. That night, I made a small fire and sat up late. I kept my flashlight in my lap, my knife and pistol beside me. At some point near midnight, I heard it again, a stick cracking, this time closer, then another. I stood up slowly and turned my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just trees. Then, as I stood there scanning the woods, I saw it barely. A shape moving between the trees, maybe 30 yards away. Not big, not fast, just slow, careful. I froze. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't move like that. It was low to the ground, almost like someone crouching. I didn't shout. I didn't want to give away where I was exactly, even though the fire did that already. I backed toward the tent slowly, picked up the gun, and stood still. The shape vanished behind a tree. Then there was silence. Nothing moved. I stood like that for maybe 20 minutes before slowly walking into the tent and zipping it shut. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there holding the gun, ears open. To first light, I packed everything. I didn't even make breakfast. I just wanted to leave. I doused the fire, took my gear, and started hiking fast. Not running, but not casual either. Every 10 minutes I looked back. I didn't see anything. I made it to the car in the early afternoon, sweaty, exhausted, and still uneasy. The car was untouched. I unlocked it, tossed my gear in, and drove without stopping until I was halfway back to town. I pulled into a gas station and sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before even getting out. I didn't call the cops. What would I say? Someone watched me in the woods? Someone took down my tarp? There were no threats, no theft, no violence. Just presence. That feeling that you're not alone when you're supposed to be. I've thought about it a lot since then. I've told a few people, left out some details, made it sound lighter than it really was. I still go hiking, still camp sometimes, but never alone anymore, and never that deep in again. Something was out there. I don't know who or why, but I know for a fact I wasn't alone. And whoever it was, they were watching from the moment I got there. Quiet, careful, patient. Could have gone worse. Much worse. I think about that sometimes. How lucky I was to leave when I did. How close I might have come to something I wasn't ready for. Something I couldn't have stopped. The forest is huge. Can hide anything. Or anyone. I went on a solo camping trip 3 years ago, and I haven't camped alone since. Started off as a break from everything. I had just left my job. Not because I got fired or anything dramatic like that, but because I felt burnt out. Every day had started to feel the same. Wake up, check emails, sit at a desk, talk to people I didn't care about, go home, microwave something bland, stare at a screen and fall asleep. I needed something different, something quiet. I hadn't done anything outdoors in a long time, so I decided I'd spend 5 days completely alone in the woods. No phone reception, no internet, no responsibilities. Just me, the trees, the wind, and whatever else lived out there. That was the plan. I picked a state park I'd never been to. It was remote enough that it didn't attract many tourists, but still legal to camp in. The kind of place with no official sites or hookups, just wilderness and a few fire pits left behind by other people who had done the same. I parked at a trailhead and hiked in about 7 miles. I passed one couple heading out with fishing poles and tired faces, but that was it. Once I got far enough in, I didn't see another person for the rest of the day. I found a clearing near a stream, flat enough to pitch a tent on, surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. I dropped my pack, set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and boiled water from the stream to make dinner. The first night was peaceful. Cool air, chirping insects, rustling leaves. I felt calm. I actually smiled when I lay back in my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. The second day, I hiked a wide circle around my camp, maybe 6 miles total, keeping my bearings and marking trees every few hundred feet with a piece of red tape. I saw a deer, a snake, and a bunch of squirrels. Nothing unusual. I found a patch of edible berries and made mental notes of landmarks. I wanted to feel comfortable, wanted to know the area better so I wouldn't get turned around later. When I got back to my camp in the early evening, everything looked untouched. My bag was where I left it, tent zipped up, fire pit clean. I boiled more water, ate dehydrated food, and sat by the fire until the sun went down. That night, I did hear something moving through the brush about 50 yards away, slow footsteps crunching through dry leaves. I told myself it was a raccoon or a possum and left it at that. Animals wander at night. That's part of camping. The third morning, I woke up feeling a little uneasy. I couldn't explain why. It wasn't something specific, more like a tightness in my chest. I sat outside my tent for a while, drinking coffee from a metal mug and watching the trees move. The sky was clear, sun just coming over the tops of the trees. It should have been peaceful, but I had this weird sense that something was off. I did a shorter loop that day, maybe 3 miles, and I noticed something strange halfway through. One of the red tape markers I had tied the day before was missing. Just one. All the others were still there, flapping in the breeze. But this one tree, about shoulder height, had the broken end of the tape hanging loose, like it had been cut or torn. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at that stupid piece of tape. Then I laughed a little, told myself it was probably the wind or some animal that pulled it loose, and I moved on. When I got back to camp that afternoon, things still looked normal. Nothing had been touched, but I still felt uneasy. I spent a lot of time just walking around my own camp, looking at the ground, the edges of the clearing, the way the undergrowth bent in certain spots. I didn't see any footprints, no trash, no sign that someone else had been there, but I still couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I'd hear a sound and sit up in my sleeping bag, sticks snapping, leaves crunching. Once I thought I heard something breathing near the tent, but when I unzipped the flap and looked out, there was nothing. Just dark trees and a moonless sky. I stayed up almost the whole night, gripping a flashlight and listening. I finally fell asleep around 4 in the morning, when it started to get light. On the 4th day, I woke up groggy and sore. My head hurt and I felt irritated at everything. My lighter was low on fluid. I had a blister forming on my heel, and my food tasted like salt and cardboard. I decided not to do a hike that day. I'd stay close to camp, gather more firewood, maybe take a nap. That afternoon, I went back to the stream to refill my water. It was only about 100 yards away, through some thick brush. I had been using the same path for the past few days, stepping over the same mossy log and ducking under the same leaning tree. But that day, something new was there. Near the stream, on the same flat rock where I usually set my filter bag, there was a small stack of stones. 5 of them, flat, gray, stacked neatly in a little tower, no more than a foot high. I stood there for a long time just looking at it. It wasn't there yesterday. I was sure of it. I had used that same rock. Someone had come through and built it. Maybe it was someone passing through, another hiker, some trail artist doing one of those balance sculptures. But it looked wrong, too purposeful, too clean. The stones weren't just stacked. They were aligned, the edges squared off in the same direction, like it meant something. I knocked it over. I told myself I was being paranoid, but deep down, I didn't want it there. I didn't like how it looked, how it felt. I filled my water bag, walked back to camp faster than usual, and didn't stop checking behind me the whole way. That night, I built a big fire and kept it going longer than usual. I used almost all the dry wood I had gathered, feeding it every few minutes just to keep it roaring. I didn't want it to go out. I didn't want to be left in the dark with just my headlamp. The woods were too quiet. No owls, no crickets, no wind. Just heavy silence pressing in on all sides. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the tent with the zipper halfway open, staring out at the fire and gripping my camping knife in one hand. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't distant. It was footsteps, slow and careful, moving just past the edge of the firelight. I stayed still, heart pounding, eyes locked on the dark shapes beyond the trees. I couldn't see anything. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was just blackness. The steps stopped for a long time, maybe 10 minutes. Then I heard them again, retreating this time, moving back into the woods. I didn't move until the sky started to lighten. When the sun finally came up, I packed. Fast. I didn't care about breakfast, didn't care about leaving trash. I shoved everything into my pack, stomped out the fire, and took off. I didn't follow the trail I had made the first day. I didn't want to pass the stream again, didn't want to see if that rock pile was back. I took a different route, one that felt like it was heading toward the trailhead. I didn't check my compass. I just moved, putting as much distance between myself and that camp as possible. I walked for hours. My legs ached. My back screamed under the weight of my pack, and I kept stumbling over roots and rocks. I was moving too fast, not paying attention. Sometime in the early afternoon, I realized I was lost, completely turned around. The trees all looked the same, and the sun was mostly hidden behind cloud cover. I stopped to rest on a log, drank the last of my filtered water, and tried to calm down. I told myself I had extra food, I had shelter, I could spend one more night out there and find the trail in the morning. I just needed to keep my head clear. But then I looked down and saw something in the dirt near my feet. A red piece of tape. Torn, crumpled, muddy. The same kind I had used to mark my trail. I hadn't been using it that day. I hadn't seen any of it in hours. But there it was, stuck under a root like someone had dropped it on purpose. That was when I panicked. I stood up and started running. Not walking, not hiking, running. I didn't care what direction. I just needed to move. I crashed through brush, ducked under branches, scraped my arms and legs on thorns. I kept going until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out and I collapsed in a patch of dead leaves. When I looked up, there was another rock stack, smaller this time, 3 stones, right in front of me, centered between 2 trees, sitting on a mossy stump. I didn't scream, couldn't. My throat was dry and tight. I turned and ran again. I don't know how long I moved. The sky started to darken again. I tripped once, fell hard on my shoulder, and just lay there for a while, staring up at the swaying tree branches overhead. That's when I heard something new. A whistle. It wasn't a tune or anything, just 2 sharp notes like someone signaling. Came from the left, then a few seconds later from the right. Then silence. I stayed on the ground until it got too cold. I didn't set up my tent. I just huddled in my sleeping bag behind a fallen tree and waited for daylight. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those rocks, those piles, like someone was leading me or watching me. I kept thinking about the red tape, the missing marker, the footsteps outside my tent. I had always liked being outside more than inside. I wasn't a professional hiker or anything, but I enjoyed long walks in the woods, pitching a tent in the middle of nowhere, making a fire, listening to the sound of branches cracking under my boots, or the crunch of dry leaves. It gave me a kind of quiet that I couldn't find back in the city. That summer, I had time off from work, almost 2 weeks, and I decided to use it all at once. No hotels, no expensive trips. Just me, my gear, and the forest. I picked a place in the northern part of the state. It was a large forested area, not a national park, just miles and miles of thick trees, some logging trails, and very little traffic. I had marked a few clearings on a digital map that looked promising. They were a good distance from the main road, not too close to any towns, but close enough that if something really bad happened, I could still get help. I loaded up my truck with all the basics: tent, sleeping bag, water purifier, freeze-dried food, flare gun, knife, extra clothes, headlamp, batteries, and some fire-starting tools. I even packed bear spray, even though I hadn't seen a bear in years. I figured it's better to have too much than not enough. I parked at the edge of the forest where a gravel logging road ended. There were no signs, no other cars, not even a trailhead. Just woods. From there, I started hiking west with the plan to follow a dried-up creek bed that cut through the forest. It was shaded, cool even in July, and the ground was soft with pine needles. After about 4 or 5 hours of slow, steady walking, I found a clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't on the digital map exactly, but it was flat, wide enough for a tent, and bordered on one side by a shallow drop-off with large rocks that would be perfect for sitting or cooking. I set up my tent, got a fire going, and made some food. The first night went smooth. The forest was alive with noise, crickets, owls, the rustle of raccoons or squirrels in the brush. But it wasn't the kind of noise that bothered me. It was the kind that actually helped me sleep. It was familiar. I felt at ease, tucked in my sleeping bag with the fire dying down to embers outside the tent. I even remember thinking that I might stay a few extra days. The second day, I hiked deeper west into the woods, mostly just exploring. The trees got denser, the light dimmer even though it was a bright day. I saw signs of animals. Tracks, scat, scratches on trees, but nothing fresh or threatening. I wasn't worried. I knew how to move slow, how to avoid startling anything. I made sure to mark my way back with bits of orange ribbon and GPS pins on my phone. I made it back to camp before sunset, lit another fire, and spent the evening writing in a small notebook I carried. I didn't see or hear anything that made me nervous, but I did get this odd feeling around dusk, like something was off. Not danger exactly, just something different. The birds had gone quiet a little earlier than the night before, and I thought I heard movement in the trees behind my tent. Not walking, not snapping branches, more like a shuffle, like a heavy foot dragging over soft ground. It happened once, then nothing. That night, I kept my knife close inside the tent. I usually zipped the door shut and didn't think twice, but I kept it a little open so I could peek out. I didn't sleep as well. Every time the wind picked up, I sat up, thinking I heard something in it. I told myself it was just my brain being too alert. The mind plays tricks when you're alone in the dark with only your own thoughts. Still, I kept waking up, eyes darting to the tent walls, looking for shadows. The third morning, I found something that didn't belong. Just outside my tent, maybe 3 feet away, the dirt looked disturbed. There was a shallow hole, not deep, maybe the size of a dinner plate, like someone had scooped it out with their hands or a stick. It wasn't there the night before. I was sure of it. I circled the whole camp, looking for more signs. Boot prints, claw marks, anything. But the ground was too soft and too covered in pine needles. I couldn't find any clear shape. It spooked me a bit, but I filled in the hole and went on with my day. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a fox digging for something, maybe even a raccoon. But I noticed I started checking over my shoulder more, especially when walking to the edge of the trees to relieve myself. It's a hard feeling to explain. It was like the woods had eyes now, and I didn't know where they were. That evening, I made the fire bigger. I burned more wood than I normally would. The light stretched farther. I kept my headlamp on even after I climbed into the tent. Every tiny sound outside made me pause. Around midnight, I heard the shuffle again, closer than before. This time, it was right outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away. I stayed completely still. I didn't breathe. It stopped. No retreating steps, just gone. I stayed awake until sunrise. When I stepped out of the tent, I didn't see anything. No tracks, no new holes, nothing out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching from the trees. I packed up a few things and hiked to a nearby ridge to get signal. I sent a few messages, just letting people know I was okay. I considered leaving. I really did, but it felt stupid to let myself get scared by nothing. I'd spent nights in worse conditions. I'd heard coyotes howling close by before. Once, I even had a skunk wander into my tent flap. I told myself this wasn't different. I stayed. That night, everything changed. I'd built up a ring of stones around the fire pit and stacked up more firewood than I needed. I ate early. I double-checked my flashlight batteries. When darkness came, I sat outside longer than I usually would, just staring into the trees, listening. The shuffle came again. Then a stick cracked. Not a dry twig, a thick branch. I froze. I didn't call out, didn't move. I just sat, staring at the trees. And then I saw it. A figure. Not clear, not close enough to see a face. But it was a person. Human-shaped. Standing half-covered behind a tree, just watching. They didn't move. They didn't say anything. Just stood there. I kept my eyes locked, trying to figure out what I was seeing. I thought it might be another camper, someone lost, but something in the way they stood didn't seem right. Too still, too deliberate. I slowly reached for my bear spray. I didn't stand up. I just kept my eyes on the tree, and then the figure stepped back behind it. Gone. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward where they were. Nothing. just trees. I stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the clearing, scanning every inch. I didn't see anything else. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside the tent with the zipper down, knife in my hand, light on my lap. I thought about packing up and leaving in the dark, but that would have meant hiking through uneven ground in pitch black. If someone was out there, they'd have an advantage. I waited for sunrise. When morning came, I broke camp fast, stuffed everything in the pack, barely took the time to clean up. I just wanted to get out. I followed the GPS path I'd marked to get back to the logging road. It should have taken me 3 hours, for at most. Took me nearly 7, because an hour into the hike, the ribbons I'd tied to trees, bright orange strips meant to help me find my way, were gone. Not faded, not torn, gone. Every single one. I know where I put them. I never forget that kind of thing. They were tied tight, high up, hard to miss. Someone had taken them. That's when panic set in. I tried to stay calm, to follow the GPS, but the compass kept acting strange. The map would rotate or freeze. I had an extra battery pack, but even after I charged the phone, the signal was weak and jumpy. I must have taken a wrong turn because I came across the same small creek twice. I had circled back. My breathing started to pick up. I stopped walking and forced myself to drink some water, eat something. I sat on a fallen log and tried to collect myself. I reminded myself I wasn't lost, just turned around. That's when I noticed it. Another hole, just like the one at my camp. Same size, same shape, freshly dug, right near where I was sitting. No other signs, no shovel, no boot prints. I didn't sit any longer. I walked fast, not running, just fast enough to put distance between me and that spot. The woods seemed quieter than they had all week. No birds, no rustling. I finally reached the road just before sunset. I saw my truck through the trees and almost dropped to my knees. When I got inside and locked the doors, I just sat there, gripping the wheel. I didn't start the engine right away. I just breathed, deep, long breaths. I looked out the windshield at the tree line, half expecting to see someone step out. No one did. I drove straight home, didn't stop. When I got back to the city, I parked in my garage and left the gear in the truck. I went inside, turned on every light, and didn't sleep that night either. Over the next few days, I kept checking the news, looking for anything, missing people, strange sightings in the forest, anything. Nothing came up. I never went back to that forest. I went on a camping trip a few years back that I've never really talked about to anyone in detail. I used to love solo camping, not because I hated people, but because I liked the silence of being far away from everything. No traffic, no phones, no talking, just the sound of nature around me. It's peaceful. At least it used to be. I planned this trip to help clear my head after some stressful months at work. Deadlines, meetings, stupid office politics. Everything was piling up, and I just needed to get away from it all. So I took a week off and drove out to a place called Black Hollow, a secluded patch of forest about 4 hours from where I lived. Black Hollow wasn't the kind of spot that was easy to find on a map. It was one of those places you heard about from someone who heard about it from someone else. I liked that. I figured the fewer people who knew about it, the better. I packed up all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, fire starter, knives, hatchet, bear spray, solar charger, water filter, everything I usually take for remote camping, and hit the road early on a Monday morning. I stopped once for fuel and food and made it to the turnoff road just after noon. The last stretch was a dirt road that narrowed the deeper I drove. Eventually, I had to park and hike the rest of the way. I slung my pack over my shoulders and started walking. The air smelled clean, like pine needles and dry earth. The trees were thick, and the trail barely looked like a trail at all. I had my GPS on me, but I didn't rely on it too much. I had a printed map, a compass, and a pretty solid sense of direction. I wasn't worried. I made camp about 4 miles in, right beside a small stream with just enough flow to keep my water topped up. There was a soft patch of ground between 2 trees, perfect for my tent, and a flat area where I could build a fire pit. I set everything up and got a fire going just before the sun started dropping behind the trees. I felt good. I felt like I was exactly where I needed to be. That first night was quiet, peaceful. I ate some dehydrated food, drank a bit of coffee from my flask, and just sat there listening to the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. I didn't hear anything strange, and I wasn't on edge. I slept fine. The next morning, I got up early and hiked deeper into the woods with just my day pack. I carried water, snacks, a knife, and my GPS. I saw a few deer, some squirrels, and a fox that darted off before I could get a good look at it. I didn't see a single human. No boot prints on the trails, no voices, no trash. I liked that. When I got back to camp around midday, something felt a little off, though. It was subtle. My tarp had shifted a bit, and one of my dry bags looked like it had been moved. Not opened, not torn, just moved. I figured maybe an animal had sniffed around, maybe a raccoon or a curious fox. I made a note to hang everything higher in the trees that night. Still, it stayed in the back of my mind. That evening, I decided to collect more firewood. I wandered a bit farther out than I had the day before. As I was breaking dead branches and gathering them into my arms, I spotted something odd about 20 feet away. An old boot, just lying there in the underbrush. It looked weathered, covered in dirt, but it wasn't rotting or falling apart. I walked over to it and nudged it with my foot. There was no foot in it, thank God, but it struck me as strange. It wasn't the kind of boot you wore out here just for fun. It looked like a serious hiking boot, maybe a bit old-fashioned. I looked around, half expecting to find the other one, but nothing. No bag, no bones, no gear. Just one boot. I didn't take it back to camp. I left it there and tried to forget about it. But that night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept listening for sounds that weren't there and thinking about who might have owned that boot. I eventually dozed off, but I kept waking up every hour, checking my watch, adjusting my sleeping bag, trying to tell myself that everything was fine. On the third day, I woke up just after sunrise and immediately noticed something strange. My fire pit looked disturbed, not just scattered by wind or a squirrel digging for scraps. The rocks I'd placed in a neat circle were pushed out of place, and there were marks in the dirt like something had been dragged across it. I checked my food bag, still tied up high, untouched, but my pack had been shifted, and the side pocket was unzipped. That's when I started feeling like maybe I wasn't alone. I did a perimeter check. No footprints, no trash, no signs of anyone. I told myself maybe I'd forgotten to zip the pocket. Maybe I'd knocked the rocks myself without realizing it. But I knew better. I had set those rocks carefully. I'd zipped every pocket. I sat there for a long time, just watching the trees, trying to hear anything that didn't belong. I decided to take a shorter hike that day, just around the area. I didn't want to go too far from camp. I kept scanning the ground, looking for anything else that might be out of place. And around mid-afternoon, I found something I still can't explain. It was a small pile of stones, stacked carefully in a column, about 2 feet high, just off the trail. I've seen stuff like that before, people making little markers or decorations, but this one didn't look decorative. It looked like a marker, like someone was trying to send a message. The stones were too clean, too precisely stacked. I knocked it over. I don't know why. Maybe I was angry. Maybe I just wanted to feel in control. When I got back to camp, everything was the same. Nothing moved, nothing missing. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, kept listening for twigs snapping or leaves rustling. That night, I didn't sleep. I laid in my sleeping bag with my knife in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I kept hearing small noises, soft shuffling, like something moving slowly through the underbrush. Every time I turned on the light, nothing was there, just trees and shadows. At one point around 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the sound of something brushing against my tent. It wasn't the wind. It was soft, like fingers running along the fabric. I held my breath, waited, and then it stopped. I didn't unzip the tent. I didn't move. I just laid there, wide awake, heart pounding in my chest, until the sky started turning light and the birds started chirping again. That morning, I made a decision. I packed up most of my gear, kept just enough to make it back to the car if I had to ditch the rest, and stashed it all under a tarp. I didn't want to leave just yet. I needed to know what was going on. I walked back out to the trail where I'd found the boot. It was gone. I swear to God it was gone. I checked the exact spot. The brush was disturbed. Something had been there. Someone had moved it. That's when I noticed something else. A set of faint impressions in the soil. Not boot prints, not really. Just indentations like someone had been standing there barefoot. The ground was dry, so they weren't clear, but they were there. I followed the impressions for maybe 20 feet, and then they vanished. No direction, no broken branches, no trail. I went back to camp, but I didn't stay long. I ate a quick meal, drank water, and waited until the sun started going down. Then I climbed a tree. I figured if someone or something was coming into my camp at night, I'd see them better from above. I didn't bring much, just my flashlight, knife, and some energy bars. I picked a big pine with a thick trunk and wedged myself in the branches about 15 feet up, just high enough to see everything. It was a long, cold night. The forest was quiet for the most part, but around midnight I saw something. Movement, figure. No light, no sound, just a shape walking slowly through the trees. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was human. No flashlight, no pack, just the faint outline of a person moving quietly between the trees. I couldn't see their face, couldn't make out any details. They came close to my camp, looked around, and then slowly turned and disappeared into the dark. I waited until dawn before climbing down. I packed everything, every scrap, every rope, every wrapper, and I left. I didn't eat, I didn't stop, I just walked. It took me most of the day to reach my car, and the entire time I felt like I was being watched. I kept stopping to check behind me, but I never saw anyone. When I finally made it to the car, I locked the doors, started the engine, and drove without stopping for over an hour. I didn't even think until I hit the highway. I remember pulling over at a gas station, washing my face in the bathroom, and realizing I was shaking. I didn't go back to that area. I didn't camp alone for over a year. Here's the thing that sticks with me the most. Whoever that was, they never made a sound. No snapping twigs, no coughing, no slipping. They were practiced, silent. That's not someone who just stumbled out there on accident. That's someone who knows those woods. Someone who knew how to move without being seen or heard. Someone who'd been watching me the whole time. I don't think it was just some random hiker. No normal person sneaks into someone's camp without a light, in the middle of nowhere, night after night. No normal person moves your things without taking anything. No normal person builds a marker like that just off the trail. And whoever they were, they didn't want to be found. That's what scares me. Not what I saw, but It was early October when I decided to go camping alone, something I hadn't done in years. The weather was already turning cold in the evenings, but I didn't mind. I'd always liked the quiet that came when the summer crowd left the woods. I had time off saved, and work had been grinding me down so hard that I couldn't think straight anymore. I needed out. So I picked a spot I remembered from a trip a few years back, a remote patch in the northern part of the national forest, where the trees grew dense and the trails weren't marked all that well. That was part of the appeal. No RVs, no kids on bikes, no music echoing through the trees. Just me and the cold air and the woods. I packed enough for a week, freeze-dried meals, a propane burner, a small hatchet, rope, a heavy-duty sleeping bag, 2 knives, a headlamp with backup batteries, and a pistol I kept locked in my safe. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I also wasn't dumb. Being out in the middle of nowhere, anything could happen. Animals, people, weather. I'd rather be over-prepared. The drive took most of the morning. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road that hadn't been maintained in years. From there, I hiked about 7 miles into the forest. Took a while because the trail was barely visible in some parts. Fallen branches, uneven ground, old moss-covered rocks. It wasn't a clean hike, but I liked that. It forced me to slow down, pay attention. Around the 5th mile, I noticed the shift. The trail got darker, the tree cover thick. The air got still. I don't mean spooky or haunted, just quiet in a way that made every step sound too loud. The kind of quiet where you start hearing the blood in your ears. I pressed on, and just as the sun started its descent, I reached the spot I had in mind. It was a wide, flat area surrounded by thick fir trees, with a small slope behind it and a narrow creek just beyond. I remembered the creek well because the water was so clear you could see straight through to the stones at the bottom. I set up my tent on the dry patch just off the treeline, facing the slope. That way, I'd have a natural barrier behind me and a good view in front. The first night was peaceful. I boiled water, ate one of the bland meals, drank some coffee, and sat for a long time just staring at the trees. No signal out there, not even a blip. I had a weather radio for updates, and it promised no storms for the next few days. After the sun dropped, the cold settled fast. I zipped myself up tight in the bag and slept early. I didn't wake up once. The next morning, I went further down past the creek, following a small game trail I hadn't noticed before. I didn't plan to go far, just enough to stretch my legs and maybe look for some kind of firewood cache. After a while, the path split. One side curved back toward the general area of my camp, but the other side dipped into a hollow filled with brush and deadfall. I stopped and stared down into it, undecided. Something about it felt off. Not dangerous exactly, just unwelcoming. The ground was darker down there, like it stayed wet longer than it should. The trees were packed close, and the silence returned. That thick, heavy kind. I stepped forward to get a closer look, and that's when I saw something. It was small at first, just a strip of faded blue fabric caught in the branch of a low bush. It looked like part of a shirt or maybe a backpack strap. I stood there staring at it, heart beating a little faster, trying to decide if I should keep going. Curiosity won. I eased down into the hollow and moved carefully, ducking under branches and stepping over logs. The ground was soft, not quite swampy, but close. The smell changed too. Damp rot like old leaves that never dried. I found more scraps, bits of cloth, a broken water bottle, something that might have been a piece of a tarp. None of it looked fresh. Could have been years old. Maybe someone got lost down here once. But then I found the shoe. It was old and crusted with dirt, but it was unmistakably a shoe. Hiking style, small, probably a woman's. I picked it up and turned it over. It had teeth marks in the sole, and the laces were shredded. I put it down and stood up straight, heart pounding now for real. I looked around again, trying to remember if I'd seen any missing persons signs at the trailhead. I hadn't. That doesn't mean much. This area didn't get much traffic, and it was easy to disappear out here. Maybe too easy. I backed out of the hollow slowly. I don't know why. It just felt wrong to turn my back on it. I kept thinking about who that shoe belonged to, how far they'd made it, what happened to them. I made it back to camp before noon, but the rest of the day felt off. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees pulled my eyes. I cooked another meal, tried to read, and went to bed early, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises. Not animals, at least not the kind I could identify. Footsteps, soft, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. But every time I sat up and shined the light around, there was nothing, just the trees and the cold. I told myself it was deer, maybe raccoons, maybe even my own mind, stirring up stories. But I stayed awake most of the night, my hand on the pistol. The next morning, I decided to take it easy. I stayed close to camp, collected firewood, sharpened my knife, and drank coffee until my hands stopped shaking. Around midday, I saw something that froze me in place. A tree not far from the edge of my sight had deep scratches in the bark. Not claw marks, knife marks. Long vertical slashes about 4 feet off the ground. I walked up and ran my fingers over them. Fresh. The exposed wood was still clean and pale. Not weathered at all. I looked around again, slow and careful, and I saw more trees marked the same way, in a rough line heading back toward the hollow. I started to think someone else was out here. Not a hiker, not a hunter. Someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who maybe lived out here off the grid. It wasn't unheard of. But the question stuck with me, why mark the trees? Was it a path? A warning? Territory? I didn't follow the marks. I didn't want to go back to that hollow. Instead, I stayed in camp and built a second fire pit closer to the tent. I made a perimeter with small trip lines, nothing fancy, just a few lines of fishing wire strung low between trees with tin cup rattles. something to alert me if anything moved nearby. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., one of the wires rattled. I sat up instantly, heart racing, light in one hand, gun in the other. I didn't move at first, just listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no animals running off. Just dead silence. I stepped out and circled slowly with the light. The cup was on the ground. The wire had been cut. Not snapped, not pulled loose, cut clean. I checked the others. One more had been cut, the rest untouched. I went back inside and sat with my back against the tent wall, eyes on the zipper, weapon ready. I stayed like that until the sky turned gray. I left the next morning, packed everything in under an hour, didn't even eat. I hiked straight back to the truck without stopping. I didn't care how tired I got. I just kept going. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything else. But the woods didn't feel empty. Back at home, I spent hours thinking through it. Could have been a survivalist, some mountain recluse marking paths. Maybe they thought I was a threat. Maybe it was just someone messing with me. But the wire being cut, clean like that, not disturbed or broken, that's what stuck with me. Whoever it was, they knew I was there and they were watching. Close enough to move through the dark, cut lines, and leave no trace. That wasn't random. That was deliberate. I still go camping. Not as often. Never alone anymore. And never near that stretch of forest. I reported the shoe, the trail markers, all of it to the rangers. They said they'd send someone to check. But I never got a follow-up. Maybe they found something. Maybe they didn't. But I can't stop thinking about the hollow. The way the trees grew too close, the scraps of fabric, the shoe, the deep silence. And how, even after I left, even after I got home and locked my door and double-checked the windows, it still felt like something had followed me out. I didn't imagine it. I know I didn't. I felt it. That kind of fear doesn't come from nothing. And whatever it was, whoever it was, I don't think I was the first person they watched. And I know I won't be the last. It was late September when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to the mountains in northern Idaho. I had been feeling worn down by work, life, and everything in between. My head was buzzing constantly, my sleep was broken, and I couldn't seem to go more than a few hours without checking my phone. I figured the only way to break out of the loop was to disconnect completely for a few days, and nothing clears the mind like being alone in the wilderness. I'd done a lot of solo camping before, mostly in Oregon and parts of Montana, but this was the furthest north I'd gone alone. I wasn't worried. I packed light, checked the weather, told one friend the general area I'd be in, and headed out early on a Friday morning. The place I chose was a lesser-known section of forest a few hours past Coeur d'Alene. There were no designated campgrounds, just dirt roads that narrowed down into hiking trails if you knew where to look. That's what I wanted. No noise from other campers, no families with screaming kids, no one with generators or music, just me and the woods. The drive up was mostly uneventful. The first stretch was paved road, then gravel, then uneven dirt and rock. I had to park my truck off a fire road and hike in the rest of the way. I hiked in about 2 miles until I found a flat spot near a slow-moving stream. The trees there were tall, mostly pine and some fir, and the ground was littered with needles and dead branches. The air smelled like damp earth and resin. It was perfect. I set up camp right on the edge of the tree line with the stream about 50 feet away. The spot was a small clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by dense trees on all sides except for the open path I'd hiked in on. I had brought a small 2-person tent, a sleeping pad, sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some food, a hunting knife, and a fire starter kit. No electronics besides a flashlight, a headlamp, and a GPS beacon I kept for emergencies. No cell service out there, which was part of the appeal. The first day was peaceful. I gathered some dry wood, made a small fire, and cooked some beans and rice. I drank water from the stream after running it through a filter. I walked a bit further up the trail just to see where it went, then came back before dark. When the sun dipped below the tree line, the air cooled fast, and I added a hoodie over my flannel. The sounds changed with the light. Birds quieted down, and I could hear small things moving in the underbrush, probably squirrels or chipmunks. I got in my tent around 9 p.m., zipped up, and laid there listening to the stream and the wind moving through the trees. That night, I woke up once. It must have been a little after midnight. There was a sharp crack of a branch outside that pulled me out of sleep. I laid still, breathing light. I didn't hear any footsteps, no snorting or heavy breathing, nothing that sounded like a large animal. I figured it could have been a small branch falling from one of the trees. That happens all the time. Still, I sat up and unzipped the tent a bit, peeking outside with my headlamp on low. I didn't see anything. No eye shine, no movement. I didn't even hear the usual rustle of small critters. That actually felt a bit odd, how quiet it was. But I told myself it was fine and went back to sleep. The second day was more of the same. Calm, peaceful, quiet. I hiked a couple miles upstream with just a small pack, knife, and some snacks. Saw a deer in the distance, heard woodpeckers tapping, sat on a big rock and watched the light shift through the trees. The kind of stillness you can't get anywhere near towns or cities. I came back to camp a few hours before dark, gathered more wood and started a fire, ate some instant noodles and jerky, boiled water, and cleaned out my little pot. It was the kind of simple rhythm I needed. Around dusk, maybe 7:30, I thought I heard something weird from the other side of the stream. It was faint, like a light thump or a footstep on wet ground. I turned and stared across the water, but the light was going fast, and the woods there were thicker. I stood up, walked a bit closer to the edge, and scanned. Nothing. No movement, no sound. I stood there for a minute or two, listening hard, but it was quiet. I told myself again it was probably a deer, maybe a raccoon, something harmless. That night, I had a harder time falling asleep. I kept thinking about the noise, kept picturing someone, something, standing just beyond the trees watching me. I knew I was alone. The chances of anyone else being out there were slim. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Around midnight, I heard it again. A crack, then a softer rustle. This time it was closer, not across the stream, but somewhere near the clearing. I sat up again, knife in hand, headlamp ready but still off. I waited. I strained my ears to hear something else. But after a minute, it went totally quiet again. I stayed up for over an hour just listening. My mind started playing tricks on me. Every creak of the trees, every groan of wind against branches sounded like someone stepping on the forest floor. But I never heard anything clear, never saw anything. Finally, I laid back down but didn't really sleep after that. I just closed my eyes and waited for the sky to get light again. By the third morning, I was feeling off. Not just tired, jittery, anxious, like something was wrong. I kept looking over my shoulder while boiling water, scanning the treeline as I packed my gear for a short hike. I almost considered packing up and heading out, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. I went for another hike, this time in the opposite direction along the ridgeline. It was quiet again, peaceful, but that feeling stuck with me like a weight on my back. I ended up cutting the hike short, turning around less than a mile in. When I got back to camp that afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. One of my firewood stacks had been moved. I always stacked wood neatly, 3 small piles by size. One of them was scattered like someone had kicked it. At first I thought maybe an animal messed with it, but none of the other stuff was touched. Not the food bag hanging from the tree, not the trash bag tied up above ground, nothing else. Just the wood. I didn't want to believe someone had been at my camp while I was gone. But the longer I stood there looking at it, the more certain I felt. I grabbed my knife and started walking the perimeter of the clearing, slowly and carefully, looking for boot prints, disturbed grass, anything. About 50 feet past my tent, I found what looked like a partial shoe print in the dirt. It wasn't clear, not enough to tell the size or tread, but it wasn't animal. It was flat, wide, like the heel of a boot. It was pointed toward my camp. I felt my whole body get tight. I scanned the woods, but of course I didn't see anything. I went back to camp fast, grabbed my GPS beacon and clipped it to my belt, then double-checked that I still had my knife on me. I started a small fire again, even though it wasn't cold. I just didn't want to be in the dark. I kept turning every few minutes, looking around, listening. It was so quiet. Not peaceful quiet like before, but dead quiet. I didn't hear birds. I didn't hear wind. It was like the woods were holding their breath. When night came, I didn't go in the tent. I sat by the fire with my back to the stream, knife in my lap, staring into the trees. The fire cracked and popped. I tried to tell myself it could still be nothing, that I was just tired and jumpy. But that didn't explain the print. That didn't explain the woodpile. Around 10 p.m., I heard something again. This time it was clear. A footstep, then another, then it stopped. I didn't move. I just listened, heart thudding in my chest. It came from behind a cluster of trees, maybe 20 yards to my left. I couldn't see anything through the dark, but the fire was still going strong. I picked up a long branch and threw it into the fire to make it flare up brighter. When it did, I thought I saw something, a shape like a person crouched low between two trees, but I blinked and it was gone. I stared at the spot for what felt like forever. Nothing moved. I stayed up the entire night. I didn't go in the tent once. Every time I felt myself starting to nod off, I forced my eyes open again. I was freezing by dawn, my back sore, hand cramped from gripping the knife. As soon as there was enough light, I packed everything up. I left half the firewood, half the food, even my water filter. I just grabbed what I needed and hiked out fast. Every step felt like I was being followed. I kept stopping and turning, but the trail behind me was always empty. Still, I never felt alone. When I got back to my truck, I threw everything in the bed and got inside. I locked the doors before I even turned the key. I didn't feel safe until I was an hour down the highway, trees shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I got to a gas station back in town. I never called the cops. What would I say? That I saw a footprint and heard a noise? That someone might have been watching me? There was no proof, no crime. Just a strong feeling and a few things out of place. But I know what I felt out there. I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me, maybe for a while, maybe from the very first night. I don't know what they wanted. Maybe just to scare me, maybe worse. I haven't gone. I used to love camping. I really did. There was something about being out there in the middle of nowhere. Just you, the trees, and the silence that always made me feel like I could breathe better. My job back home was hectic, managing shipments in a warehouse, and most of my days were loud, filled with people barking orders, machines screeching, forklifts whining. After a while, all that noise gets into your skull and stays there, even when you get home. So, I started making it a habit to take solo camping trips, 2 or 3 times a year, always somewhere deep, somewhere quiet. That peace kept me going. This story happened in late September. I remember that clearly because the trees had just started to turn, but the temperatures were still comfortable during the day. I decided on a spot up in northern Pennsylvania, in one of those deep stretches of state forest where the cell signal cuts out before you even reach the trailhead. I'd been there once before a year prior, and I remembered it being especially quiet. Barely any foot traffic, no nearby roads, and more wildlife than people. That's exactly what I was looking for. I packed up the basics: tent, sleeping bag, jet boil stove, a few mountain house meals, first aid kit, knife, headlamp, bear spray, a small hatchet, and enough water purification tablets for a week. I also brought a solar battery just to keep my phone alive in case I needed GPS or wanted to take photos. But I didn't expect to use the phone much. I was more excited about getting away from screens. I left early on a Friday morning, around 5, and reached the dirt pull-off lot by 9:30. There were no other cars, which didn't surprise me. The trail wasn't even marked properly. Just an overgrown old fire road that curved its way down toward a stream. After walking for about 2 hours with a steady pace, I found the clearing I had remembered from last year. It was maybe 20 feet across, flat, and nestled between a thick line of hemlocks and a small hill. The stream was just a 5-minute walk downhill, and you could hear it bubbling faintly from camp. It was perfect. I set up the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and spent a bit of time clearing the fire pit that had half collapsed since last year. I gathered some dead wood from around the area, careful to keep the firewood in a separate dry pile under a fallen tree that made a sort of makeshift roof. The sun was high by then, and it was a clear sky with only the occasional breeze. I sat back on a camp stool, ate a protein bar, and felt that old calm settle over me like a blanket. That first day passed like it always did. I explored a little off-trail, following a narrow deer path that led through thicker brush and into a dense patch of firs. I spotted deer scat, a few tracks, and some torn-up ground where turkeys had been scratching. On the way back, I saw a pile of bones, likely from a deer. The ribs were picked clean, bleached in parts. That didn't strike me as weird. Animals die, and scavengers clean up the rest. That's just the way the woods work. As the sun started dipping, I lit a small fire, boiled some water, and ate one of the freeze-dried meals. Tasted like salted cardboard, but it was warm and filling. I sat by the fire for hours just watching the flames, listening to the sounds around me. The owls, the breeze, the occasional snap of a twig deep in the woods. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and fell asleep to the rustle of wind in the trees. The next day was when things started to feel off. I woke up around 6. Normally I sleep until at least 8 on these trips, but something had stirred me. It wasn't a noise. It was more like a feeling. I laid there for a while listening, thinking maybe a raccoon or something had come sniffing around the tent, but everything was dead quiet. Too quiet, actually. Usually there's a chorus of morning birds around that time, sparrows, robins, maybe a woodpecker. But that morning it was just nothing. No wind, no bird calls, just stillness. I got up and stepped outside. The fire pit was undisturbed. Nothing had been dragged or scattered, and the woods looked the same. But that quiet, it hung in the air like a weight. I walked down to the stream to fill my bottles and check for tracks, thinking maybe a bigger animal had come through. The mud around the stream was soft, and I did see prints, deer mostly, but there were a few that looked strange. Long, narrow impressions with no clear tread. Too long to be from a coyote, too narrow for a bear. At first I wondered if someone else had come through, maybe wearing hiking boots with a weird sole pattern. But I hadn't heard anything, and I hadn't seen a single soul since arriving. I spent the day trying to brush it off. I hiked further out along the ridge, checked my GPS, and marked a few spots to return to later. But all day, the sense that something was wrong never left me. Every time I stopped walking, the silence would creep in again. That's when I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all day. Not one. No squirrels either. The only time I saw movement in the woods was a quick glimpse of a white tail flashing through the trees. Even that seemed too fast, like the deer was spooked by something. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, thinking I'd heard footsteps or twigs snapping outside the tent. But whenever I turned on my headlamp and checked, there was nothing. Just the same silence pressing in from every direction. I barely slept 3 hours. The third day was worse. I woke up groggy and irritable, and when I went to light the stove for coffee, I found my fuel canister missing. I searched everywhere. Checked the fire pit, my bag, the bushes, even under the tarp, but it was gone. At first I figured I had misplaced it. Maybe I'd used it the night before and forgot to pack it up. But the rest of my gear was exactly where I'd left it. My hatchet was still in the stump I'd been splitting wood on. My flashlight was clipped to my tent flap. Nothing else was disturbed, just the fuel canister. That shook me more than I wanted to admit. If an animal had dragged it off, why not take anything else? Why not chew into my food bag or tip over the water container? And if it was a person, why take something so specific and nothing else? It didn't make sense. I forced myself to eat cold food that morning and spent the next few hours reinforcing the camp. I built up the fire pit, added extra wood to the pile, and double-checked that my knife and bear spray were easily reachable. I told myself I was just being cautious, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. That afternoon, while hiking back toward the ridge I'd marked the day before, I came across something that stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a pile of rocks, about chest high, stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. That pile hadn't been there yesterday. I was absolutely sure of it. The trail was narrow, and I would have had to step around it if it had. It wasn't natural either. The rocks were too evenly placed, too balanced. Some of them looked like they had moss scraped off recently. I stood there staring at it for a long time. Eventually, I knocked it over. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed to feel like I had some control over the situation. The rocks tumbled down the hill, and the silence snapped back like a rubber band. I got the hell out of there and went straight back to camp. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with my knife on my lap and a flashlight in my hand. I kept the fire going until nearly dawn, and even then, I didn't feel safe. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving up on the ridge behind camp. Just a single thump, like a footfall on packed dirt. Then nothing. No other sounds. Just that one noise, loud enough to snap me alert, and then gone. I didn't move. I just sat there, listening, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But I knew better. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was gonna pack up and hike out. I didn't care if it cut my trip short. I'd had enough. But when I stepped out of the tent, I saw something that nearly made me fall over. There was a fresh boot print in the dirt just a few feet from my fire pit. A single, clear, human footprint. It wasn't mine. I checked my own boots, compared the treads, and they didn't match. The one in the dirt was a different pattern, narrower, with a deep heel groove. And it was fresh, edges still sharp, not even smudged by wind or dew. That was it for me. I packed everything in under 20 minutes. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, even the trash. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just grabbed my gear and bolted. I didn't even take the trail. I cut straight through the woods, using my compass and GPS to guide me back toward the car. I didn't care if it was harder. I didn't want to pass that rock pile again. I didn't want to see any more prints. I just wanted out. It took me 3 hours to reach the road. I was scratched up from the brush, sweating, and shaking by the time I got to the car. The whole time I felt like something was watching me. I kept looking back, scanning the woods, but I never saw anyone. Just trees, just silence. When I finally started the car and drove off, I felt a wave of relief I can't even describe. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I hit a gas station 40 miles away. I sat in the parking lot for almost half an hour before I could even get out and go inside. I don't know what I stumbled into out there. Maybe someone else had been camping nearby and didn't like that I was so close. Maybe it was some paranoid survivalist who thought I've been camping since I was a kid. My dad used to take me out into the mountains every summer, usually the same spots, and we'd fish, hike, build fires, and just be outside for a few days with no signal and no city noise. As I got older, I kept the habit going. Sometimes I'd go with a friend or two, but honestly, I liked solo camping more. There's a quiet that settles over you when you're alone in the woods, and once you get used to the isolation, it starts to feel like home. You get to know the little sounds, the creaking trees, the scurrying of animals in the underbrush, the wind sliding through the branches above you. All of it becomes normal, comforting even. So that's why, last September, I decided to take a solo trip out into the Cascades. I had a 4-day weekend coming up and no plans. I picked a spot I hadn't tried before, near a less popular trail that branched off from a forest road. The area wasn't part of any official campsite, but it was legal to camp there, and I figured I'd see fewer people that way. I wanted real quiet this time. I brought everything I needed: stove, fuel, food, sleeping gear, solar battery, even bear spray just in case. I double-checked the weather, told my brother where I'd be, and drove up early Friday morning. The forest road that led to the trail was rough. My truck's tires kicked up dust the whole way and rattled hard over the loose rocks. There were long stretches where branches scraped the side panels. No one else was parked at the trailhead when I got there, which was exactly what I'd hoped for. I locked up, strapped on my pack, and started hiking. The first few miles were steady incline, not too hard, and the trail ran alongside a stream that I could hear most of the way. There were small wooden bridges over parts of it, and I took my time crossing them, just listening to the water rush by. It was cool in the shade, but the sun was out, and the air felt clean in a way you don't get back in the city. I hiked for about 3 hours before I broke off from the main trail and followed a narrow, unmarked path I'd seen on an old topo map. It led deeper into the forest, more uneven terrain, and clearly not used often. I had to duck under fallen branches and push through brush in a few places. The quiet out there was different. The further in I went, the more muffled everything felt, like the trees were absorbing all the noise. It made every twig I stepped on sound louder than it should have been. I kept glancing over my shoulder without really knowing why. I wasn't scared, just hyper-aware. By mid-afternoon, I found a spot that looked good enough to set up camp. It was a small clearing tucked between a wall of pines and a mossy rise that sloped down toward a gully. I could hear water trickling not far off, probably a feeder stream. The ground was mostly flat, the area shaded, and there were no signs that anyone else had been there recently. No boot prints, no fire ring, nothing. I set up my tent, unpacked the essentials, and took a walk to find the water source. It was a thin stream coming off the hillside, perfectly clear and cold. I filled my bottle and used my filter before heading back to camp. That first night was uneventful. I made dinner, read by headlamp until the bugs got too annoying, then crawled into my sleeping bag and lay there listening to the forest settle down. I slept light, as I usually do the first night, waking up a few times when branches cracked or owls called. But it wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. That morning, I took a long hike further up the slope to get a view of the valley. The trail vanished after a while, so I had to bushwhack a little. I didn't mind it. I was used to navigating by terrain and compass, but the brush was thicker than I expected, and I had to work harder than I wanted to get through. By the time I reached the top, I was dripping sweat and scratched up along my arms and legs. But the view was worth it. You could see all the way across the forest to the next ridge. I didn't see any smoke, no other hikers, no signs of movement anywhere. I sat up there for a while, ate a protein bar, drank water, and just took it all in. On my way back down, I took a different path, trying to loop around instead of retracing my steps. That's when I started noticing little things that didn't quite sit right with me. First, I passed a pile of branches that looked like they'd been stacked deliberately, not just fallen, but arranged, about knee-high. I figured maybe a hunter had passed through and left a marker, though it wasn't the typical kind. Then, about 50 yards further down, I saw a tree with bark peeled off in wide strips. Not claw marks, I've seen bear markings before, and this wasn't that. It looked like someone had used a knife or hatchet to strip the outer bark clean in long, curling strips. I crouched down and looked around, but there were no signs of recent activity. No tracks, no trash, nothing. I started walking again, a little more alert now. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping low behind the trees. I built a fire, heated up dinner, and tried to push the strange feeling away. It wasn't unusual to see odd stuff in the woods. Hunters, surveyors, even other campers sometimes left weird things behind. I didn't like it, but it didn't mean anything bad. Still, I didn't sleep well that night either. I kept waking up to the sound of twigs snapping. Not big ones, just little cracks like someone stepping slowly, carefully. I sat up a few times and shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing. I didn't hear any animals scurrying. No snorting or huffing like deer usually make. Just silence after the snapping stopped, like someone freezing when the light came on. I told myself I was just imagining it. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of my campsite, checking for prints. The soil was soft enough in some places that you'd expect to see something. Raccoon, deer, even squirrels. But there wasn't much. Just one area, behind a tree on the edge of the clearing, where the ground was scuffed up like someone had turned on their heel and walked off. No defined print, but the moss and dirt were disturbed in a circular pattern. I stood there for a while just staring at it. That day, I decided not to hike far. I stayed close to camp, collected more wood, filtered extra water, sharpened my knife, and kept scanning the treeline. I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I even hung my food higher than usual, out of pure instinct. That night, I didn't light a fire. I ate cold and sat in the dark, back against the tent, just watching. The moon wasn't out, so the whole forest was pitch black, except for where my headlamp pointed. At some point in the night, I heard something again. This time, it wasn't twigs breaking. It was breathing, just outside the tent. Slow, shallow, barely audible. But it was there. I turned on my light and unzipped the flap in one motion. But there was nothing. No movement, no sound. I got out and circled the tent with the light. Nothing. But I didn't sleep after that. The fourth day was supposed to be my last, and I planned to break camp early. But when I stepped out of the tent at first light, I froze. The rope I'd used to hang my food had been cut. Not broken, not chewed, cleanly sliced. The bag was gone. I searched around and eventually found it about 20 yards away. Empty, the contents spread out in the dirt. Some of it had been opened, not clawed through, but opened like someone had gone through it methodically. The wrappers were folded. The cans were stacked. Nothing was shredded. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was just animals or paranoia. Someone had been in my camp, watching me, waiting until I was asleep. I packed as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the stove twice trying to shove it into my bag. I didn't eat, didn't check the water, just took what I could carry and started heading back. I had my knife out the whole way. I didn't take the path I'd used to get in. I took the more direct, downhill route even though it was steeper. I wanted to be out of there as fast as possible. About a mile down, I heard movement off to my left. Not animal movement, heavy footfalls moving parallel to me, keeping pace. I stopped and so did the noise. I moved again and it picked up. I cut hard right, bushwhacked through brush, changed direction again, and the sound stopped. I couldn't tell how close they were, but they were following me. I moved faster, almost running at one point, branches slapping me in the face and arms. I lost the trail twice and had to backtrack. I didn't stop for anything, didn't even drink water. When I finally reached the forest road, I almost cried. I could see my truck just up ahead, untouched, right where I'd left it. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my pack into the bed, and jumped into the cab. I didn't look back. I just drove, tires spitting gravel behind me, until I hit pavement. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I told the ranger station about it, as much as I could without sounding crazy. They said they'd check it out, but they didn't seem too concerned. Maybe they hear stuff like that often, I don't know. I haven't been back to that part of the forest since. I still go camping, but I stick to marked areas now, places where I know I'm not truly alone. I carry a GPS beacon, a trail cam, and I don't camp solo anymore. The forest doesn't feel the same after that trip. It's not the quiet I remember. Now it feels like something's always just out of sight, waiting,